The phone in Daniel Whitfield's hand shook as he stared at the message on the screen. His wedding was in 11 days, and the woman he had promised to marry, Clara Bennett, was standing right in front of him, waiting for an answer he could not give. He had just received a text from Isabel Voss, a woman he had met only 3 weeks earlier, and the words on that screen had changed everything. Clara reached for his hand, but Daniel pulled it away without thinking. Her eyes searched his face for a reason, but he had none that he was ready to say out loud. "Daniel, what is wrong with you?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "You have been distant for days. Talk to me." He looked at her, this woman who had loved him since they were teenagers, riding bicycles down the same dirt road, who had stood by him through every failed business idea and every hard winter, and he felt something he did not expect. He felt trapped, not by her, but by the smallness of the life they were about to build together. Isabel's message had reminded him of a world he had only glimpsed at a business dinner weeks before, a world of private planes, marble floors, and family names that opened doors most people never even saw. "I need some air," Daniel said, and walked out of the small apartment they had been furnishing together, leaving Clara standing alone with unanswered questions and a growing sense of dread. Outside, the night was cool, and Daniel walked without direction, his mind spinning. 3 weeks earlier, he had been invited to a charity gala hosted by a shipping company, hoping to win his family's small logistics business as a client. He had gone reluctantly, wearing a suit that did not quite fit him, standing at the edge of a room filled with people who seemed to belong to a different species entirely. That was where he saw her. Isabel Voss stood near a tall window, laughing softly at something a waiter had said, her deep blue gown catching the light from the chandeliers above. She was not just wealthy. She was the niece of a European noble family, one whose name still carried weight in certain circles, a family with old money and older titles, even if those titles no longer held political power. When Daniel was introduced to her by mistake, mistaken for someone else's business partner, she had not corrected the confusion right away. Instead, she asked him about his work, and for the first time in years, someone had looked at him like he mattered. "You run a logistics company?" she had asked, tilting her head with genuine interest. "That must be difficult work, moving things across the world, keeping everything on time." "It is not glamorous," Daniel admitted, "but it keeps the lights on." Isabel had laughed, a light, easy sound. "I find that far more interesting than most of the people in this room. Everyone here talks about yachts and vacations. You talk about work that matters." That single conversation had planted a seed in Daniel's mind that he could not uproot. Over the following weeks, Isabel began reaching out, first with polite messages asking about his business, then with invitations to lunch under the guise of possible investment opportunities. Daniel told himself it was only professional. He told Clara it was only professional. But somewhere along the way, professional conversations turned into long phone calls that stretched past midnight, and Daniel began comparing his quiet, steady life with Clara to the dazzling possibilities Isabel seemed to represent. Clara had noticed the change before Daniel was willing to admit it to himself. She noticed how he checked his phone more often, how he grew quiet during dinner, how his enthusiasm for their wedding plans had faded into polite agreement rather than excitement. She loved him enough to give him space, believing that whatever was troubling him would pass. She had no idea that the woman on the other end of his phone calls was slowly convincing him that his entire future could look different. That night, after leaving Clara standing confused in their apartment, Daniel found himself outside a small cafe that stayed open late, and he called Isabel without thinking twice. "I cannot stop thinking about you," he admitted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "But I am supposed to be married in 11 days. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Isabel's voice, calm and deliberate, came through. "Daniel, I would never ask you to choose me over your own happiness. But you called me tonight, not the other way around. That tells you something, does it not?" Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of a decision pressing down on him. Isabel continued, her voice gentle but firm. "You deserve a life that matches the size of your ambition. I have seen the way you talk about your work, your dreams for expansion, the markets you want to enter. Clara is a kind woman, I am sure. But does she understand that world? Can she stand beside you in it?" The question lodged itself in Daniel's mind like a splinter. He did not answer Isabel that night, but he did not need to. The seed had already grown into something he could not ignore. Over the next few days, Daniel became a stranger even to himself. He avoided Clara's calls, made excuses about work emergencies, and spent long hours in meetings that were not really meetings at all, but quiet dinners with Isabel, where she painted pictures of a future filled with international offices, family connections, and doors opening, simply because of the company he would keep. She never once pressured him directly. She did not need to. She simply made herself available, warm, and endlessly encouraging, while subtly reminding him of everything he could gain. Clara, meanwhile, tried to hold on to hope. She visited her mother, Grace Bennett, one evening, seeking comfort in the small kitchen where she had grown up. "He has not been himself," Clara said, stirring a cup of tea she had no intention of drinking. "I do not know what is wrong, Mom. He will not talk to me." Grace, a practical woman who had raised Clara alone after her husband passed, studied her daughter's face carefully. "Sometimes people get scared before a big change. Marriage is a big change, even a good one. Give him time, sweetheart, but do not lose yourself waiting for someone to find their way back to you." Clara nodded, though the words did little to ease the tightness in her chest. She had known Daniel since they were 14 years old, had watched him grow from a boy with big dreams and little direction into a man determined to build something of his own. She had believed in him when banks refused to give him loans, when his first 2 business attempts failed, when he doubted himself more than anyone else ever could. She had never once considered that the very success she had helped him imagine might one day become the reason he left her behind. 3 days before the wedding, Daniel finally worked up the courage, or perhaps the cruelty, to tell Clara the truth. He asked her to meet him at the small park where he had proposed 2 years earlier, thinking somehow that the location would soften the blow. It did not. "Clara, I cannot marry you," he said, unable to meet her eyes. "I have met someone else. Her name is Isabel. I know this is sudden, and I know it is unfair to you, but I cannot go through with the wedding, pretending everything is fine." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. The evening breeze moved through the trees around them, and somewhere in the distance, children laughed on a playground, oblivious to the quiet devastation happening on a nearby bench. When Clara finally spoke, her voice was steady, though her eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. "How long?" she asked simply. "It does not matter," Daniel said, though of course it did. "It matters to me," Clara replied. "I deserve to know how long you have been lying to me, Daniel." He exhaled slowly. 3 weeks. I met her at the gala. Nothing happened between us in the way you might think, but I could not stop thinking about her, about the life she represents. I am sorry, Clara. I never meant to hurt you. Clara stood up from the bench, smoothing the front of her dress with hands that trembled only slightly. You did not just hurt me, Daniel. You made a fool of me. Everyone knows we were supposed to get married in 3 days. My dress is already altered. My mother already paid the caterer. I will cover every cost, Daniel said quickly, as though money could repair what he had broken. Clara let out a short, humorless laugh. You think this is about money? Daniel, I loved you. I trusted you with everything, and you threw it away for a woman you met 3 weeks ago because she comes from money and a fancy family name. I hope she is worth it. She turned and walked away, refusing to look back, refusing to let him see the tears that finally fell once she was out of his sight. Daniel sat alone on the bench for a long time afterward, telling himself that the ache in his chest was simply the discomfort of change, not the early signs of regret. He wanted to believe that the life waiting for him with Isabel would fill whatever emptiness he felt in that moment. News of the broken engagement spread quickly through their small town. Friends who had once admired Daniel's determination now whispered about his sudden change of heart. Clara's co-workers offered sympathetic glances, while some acquaintances quietly judged her, wondering what she could have done to drive him away. Clara refused to explain herself to anyone beyond the basic truth. Daniel had ended things. She would not beg for his return, and she would not pretend to be ashamed of a betrayal that was never her fault. Meanwhile, Daniel found himself swept into a whirlwind unlike anything he had experienced before. Isabel introduced him to her family through a series of video calls at first, since most of them lived abroad. Her father, a reserved man with sharp eyes named Edward Voss, asked pointed questions about Daniel's business and his prospects. questions that felt more like an evaluation than a welcome. Her mother, Margaret Voss, was warmer, though her warmth carried an edge of curiosity, as though she were studying a rare specimen, rather than meeting her daughter's new partner. "You must understand," Isabel told Daniel after one such call. "My family does not simply accept anyone. They will test you, in their own way. But once they accept you, you will want for nothing." Daniel nodded, eager to prove himself, unaware of just how literally that testing would unfold in the months ahead. He had left behind a woman who loved him without condition, for a family that measured worth in performance and utility. In the excitement of new beginnings, he did not yet see the difference. He only saw the glittering future Isabel promised, a future that seemed, for now, entirely within his reach. As the days passed, Daniel packed away the small apartment he and Clara had once shared, placing photographs and mementos into boxes destined for storage rather than a life together. He told himself this was simply the natural order of things, that people changed, that love was not always meant to last, and that ambition sometimes required sacrifice. He did not yet understand that the family he was about to join valued control far more than affection, and that estates offered as gifts often came with strings sharp enough to cut. For now, though, Daniel Whitfield stood at the edge of a new life, dazzled by its shine, unaware that behind the elegant smiles and warm introductions, a far more complicated story was only just beginning. 6 weeks after Daniel broke off his engagement, he stood in a private garden behind the Voss family estate in the countryside, wearing a tailored suit that fit him perfectly for the first time in his life. Isabel walked beside him, her arm linked through his, pointing out details of the sprawling property, as though she were showing him a piece of her own history, rather than simply a house. "My grandmother planted these roses herself," Isabel said, gesturing toward a row of deep red blooms along the garden path. "This place has been in the family for generations. Soon it will feel like home to you too." Daniel smiled, though a small, uneasy feeling had begun to settle in his stomach. Everything around him felt borrowed, as though he were an actor playing a role in someone else's life. The staff who tended the grounds addressed him formally, calling him sir, with a stiffness that made him feel more like a guest than a future member of the family. Still, he pushed the feeling aside, reminding himself that adjustment took time. That evening, Edward Voss called Daniel into his study, a room lined with old books and framed photographs of ancestors whose stern expressions seemed to follow Daniel as he crossed the floor. Edward gestured to a leather chair across from his large wooden desk, and Daniel sat, trying to appear more confident than he felt. "You wish to marry my daughter," Edward said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact already understood. "Yes, sir," Daniel replied. "I love Isabel very much." Edward studied him for a long moment, tapping his fingers lightly against the desk. "Love is a pleasant word, Daniel, but it does not build empires. Isabel has grown up with certain expectations, certain standards. I want to know that the man she marries can meet them, not just today, but for the rest of his life." "I run a successful logistics company," Daniel said, straightening in his seat. "I built it from nothing. I understand hard work, and I am willing to do whatever it takes to provide for her." Edward allowed a small, measured smile. "A logistics company is a fine start, but it is small compared to what our family manages. I have decided, as a wedding gift, to transfer ownership of one of our secondary estates into your name, Ashcombe Manor. It is not our largest property, but it is significant, with land, tenant income, and a respectable history. This will help establish you as a man of standing in Isabel's world." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Ashcombe Manor was the kind of property he had only seen in magazines, a sprawling estate with acres of land, a grand house, and a legacy stretching back centuries. The idea that it could soon belong to him felt almost unreal. "Sir, I do not know what to say," Daniel managed. "Thank you. I promise I will honor the responsibility." Edward's eyes narrowed slightly, though his smile remained. "See that you do. Everything in this family comes with expectation, Daniel. Nothing is given freely without purpose." Daniel nodded, too caught up in the excitement of the moment to fully absorb the weight of those words. He left the study that night, feeling as though he had passed some invisible test, unaware that Edward's careful phrasing had been a warning, disguised as generosity. The wedding took place 2 months later, a lavish affair held on the grounds of the Voss family estate, attended by dignitaries, business leaders, and distant relatives whose titles Daniel could barely keep straight. Isabel wore a gown, embroidered with delicate lace, and Daniel stood at the altar in a suit finer than anything he had ever owned, watching her walk toward him with a mixture of pride and disbelief. It felt, for a moment, like a fairy tale come true. Yet even amid the celebration, small cracks in the perfect image began to show. During the reception, Daniel overheard two of Isabel's cousins speaking quietly near the bar. "Do you think he understands what he has gotten himself into?" one of them murmured, swirling a glass of champagne. "Ashcombe Manor is no small gift. Uncle Edward does not simply hand over property out of kindness." "He will learn soon enough," the other replied with a knowing chuckle. "They always do." Daniel pretended not to hear, forcing a smile as he greeted more guests. But the words lingered in the back of his mind, long after the music faded and the last of the guests departed. In the weeks that followed, Daniel and Isabel moved into Ashcombe Manor, and Daniel found himself overwhelmed by both its beauty and its scale. The house had more rooms than he could count, a staff that managed nearly every aspect of daily life, and grounds so vast that he often lost track of time simply walking them. He began referring to himself, half-jokingly, as the Lord of the Manor, delighting in a lifestyle he once could only imagine. However, Daniel soon discovered that owning a grand estate came with responsibilities far beyond enjoying its luxury. Tenant farmers who worked portions of the land expected fair management. Local business leaders sought his involvement in community affairs, assuming his new status meant influence and generosity. Isabel's family, most of all, expected him to represent their name with the same care and discretion they themselves practiced. One afternoon, Daniel sat in the estate's grand study, reviewing documents related to the property's finances, and realized with a growing sense of unease that the numbers did not fully make sense. Certain accounts seemed tied not just to Ashcombe Manor, but to broader family investments controlled by Edward Voss. When Daniel asked Isabel about it over dinner that evening, she waved a hand dismissively. "That is simply how the family manages things," she explained. "Everything is interconnected. It keeps our finances stable and protects the estate from unnecessary risk." "But it is my estate now," Daniel said carefully. "Should I not have full control over its finances?" Isabel's expression flickered, just for a moment, before settling back into its usual warmth. "Of course, darling. In time, you will have full understanding of everything. My father simply prefers to oversee transitions carefully. It is his way of protecting the family's legacy." Daniel accepted her explanation, though a small seed of doubt had been planted. He told himself he was simply unfamiliar with the customs of old, established families, that patience would eventually earn him the trust and independence he sought. He did not yet realize that within the Voss family, trust was not something freely given. It was something extracted through obedience, tested repeatedly, and revoked without warning whenever convenient. Meanwhile, far from the grandeur of Ashcombe Manor, Clara Bennett had begun rebuilding her life in quiet, deliberate steps. She had moved into a small apartment near her mother's home, thrown herself into her work at a local design firm, and slowly allowed herself to breathe again after months of heartbreak. Friends who had witnessed her pain during the broken engagement now noticed a subtle shift in her, a quiet strength that had not been there before. "You seem different lately," her friend Charlotte remarked one evening as they shared coffee at a small cafe. "Stronger somehow." Clara smiled softly, stirring her drink. "I had to learn how to stand on my own again. It was not easy, but I think I am finally finding my footing." She had heard, through mutual acquaintances, about Daniel's extravagant wedding and his new life at Ashcombe Manor. Part of her still felt the sting of betrayal when his name came up, but a larger part of her felt something close to relief. She no longer had to wonder what might have been. She could focus entirely on building a life defined by her own choices, rather than waiting for someone else to decide her worth. Back at Ashcombe Manor, Daniel's sense of unease continued to grow, even as he tried to convince himself that everything was simply part of an adjustment period. Isabel remained affectionate, attentive, and supportive on the surface, yet Daniel noticed subtle patterns forming beneath their daily life. Major decisions regarding the estate always seemed to require Edward's approval. Staff members sometimes referred questions to the family's main office, rather than to Daniel directly. Even social invitations extended to him often mentioned his connection to the Voss family before acknowledging his own name or accomplishments. One evening, as Daniel walked alone through the estate's expansive gardens, his phone buzzed with a message from Henry Colton, an old business partner and friend from before his transformation into a member of high society. "Congratulations again on the wedding," Henry's message read. "Ashcombe Manor looks incredible in the photos. How does it feel to finally have everything you always wanted?" Daniel stared at the message for a long moment before typing his reply. "It feels different than I expected," he wrote honestly. "Beautiful, but complicated. I will explain more when I see you." He set the phone down and looked out over the darkening grounds, the manor's grand silhouette rising behind him against the fading light. For the first time since meeting Isabel, Daniel allowed himself a fleeting, uncomfortable thought. He wondered whether the life he had built so quickly rested on a foundation as solid as it appeared, or whether it had been constructed on expectations he did not yet fully understand. He pushed the thought aside as he had done so many times before, choosing instead to focus on the beauty surrounding him rather than the quiet warnings whispering beneath it. Yet somewhere deep within him, a small part of Daniel Whitfield had already begun to sense that the price of his new life had not yet been fully paid, and that the true cost might be far greater than he had ever imagined. A year into his marriage, Daniel Whitfield sat across from Edward Voss at a long conference table, surrounded by advisors and lawyers he barely recognized. What was supposed to be a simple discussion about expanding his logistics company into European markets had turned into something far more complicated. Edward wanted Daniel's company folded entirely under the umbrella of the Voss family holdings, absorbed into a structure where Daniel would technically remain a director, but where every major decision would require approval from a board dominated by Voss relatives. "This is not a request, Daniel," Edward said, his tone calm but firm. "It is simply the natural next step. Your company benefits from our resources, our connections, our reputation. In exchange, we protect our interests by keeping oversight close." Daniel felt his jaw tighten. "With respect, sir, I built that company from nothing. It carries my name, my years of work. I am not opposed to partnership, but I built it to be independent." Edward's expression did not change, though something in his eyes hardened. "Independence is a luxury for those without family obligations. You married into this family, Daniel. Ashcombe Manor bears our name in its history. It seems only fitting that your business reflects the same unity." The room fell silent, the weight of Edward's words settling over everyone present. Daniel glanced toward Isabel, seated near the end of the table, hoping for some sign of support. She offered a small, uncertain smile, but said nothing to challenge her father. That night, back at Ashcombe Manor, Daniel confronted Isabel in the privacy of their bedroom. "Why did you not say anything today?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration. "Your father wants to absorb my company entirely. Did you know about this beforehand?" Isabel sighed, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "Daniel, you have to understand my father's world. He believes in consolidation, in protecting the family's interests. He is not trying to take anything from you. He is trying to secure your future within our family." "It does not feel like securing anything," Daniel replied. "It feels like control." Isabel reached for his hand, her expression softening. "I promise you, if you simply show him loyalty, he will ease his grip over time. My father tests everyone this way. Even my own siblings had to prove themselves before he trusted them fully." Daniel wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that patience would eventually earn him the independence he craved. Yet the conversation at the conference table replayed in his mind for days afterward, a persistent reminder that the life he had chosen came with conditions far stricter than he had anticipated. In the weeks that followed, tension within the family grew more apparent, though it remained carefully hidden behind polished smiles and formal gatherings. Daniel began noticing that his opinions were rarely sought during family discussions about the estate's future, that decisions regarding tenant agreements, charitable contributions, and even household staff were made without consulting him directly. When he raised concerns, Isabel would gently redirect the conversation, assuring him that patience and loyalty would eventually earn him greater influence. Margaret Voss, Isabel's mother, seemed to notice Daniel's growing frustration more than anyone else in the family. One afternoon, as they walked together through the estate's rose garden, she spoke to him with unexpected candor. "You must understand, Daniel," she said, her voice gentle but knowing. This family does not simply welcome outsiders with open arms. Every gift comes wrapped in expectation. Every kindness carries a purpose. My husband did not become successful by giving anything away freely. Then why extend the estate to me at all? Daniel asked. Why bring me into the family this way, if trust is so difficult to earn? Margaret paused, considering her words carefully. Because appearances matter to my husband, almost as much as control. A son-in-law who owns Ashcombe Manor reflects well on our family's generosity and status. Whether that ownership remains secure depends entirely on how well you serve the family's interests. Her words settled over Daniel like a heavy fog, confirming suspicions he had tried to dismiss for months. He thanked Margaret for her honesty, though the conversation left him more unsettled than reassured. Meanwhile, Daniel's old friend, Henry Colton, arrived for a visit to Ashcombe Manor, eager to see the grand estate his friend now called home. Walking through the sprawling gardens, Henry could not hide his amazement. "This place is unbelievable, Daniel," Henry said, shaking his head. "I still cannot believe this is yours." Daniel offered a tight smile. "Some days I cannot believe it either." Henry glanced at him, sensing something beneath his friend's carefully composed expression. "You do not seem as happy as I expected. Is everything all right?" Daniel hesitated, glancing toward the manor's grand windows before answering honestly. "It is complicated, Henry. Everything looks perfect from the outside, but there are strings attached to all of this that I did not fully understand when I agreed to it." Henry frowned, concern evident in his eyes. "What kind of strings?" "My company," Daniel admitted. "Edward wants full control folded into the family holdings. My independence, my decisions, even simple things around the estate, all require his approval. I feel less like an owner and more like a guest who has not yet worn out his welcome." Henry considered this for a long moment before speaking carefully. "Daniel, you left Clara for this life. Do not misunderstand me. I am not judging your choices. But you gave up something real and steady for a world that seems to demand constant proof of loyalty. Are you certain this is worth it?" The question struck Daniel harder than he expected. He thought of Clara often, more than he cared to admit, wondering how different his life might feel had he chosen steadiness over spectacle. Yet pride kept him from voicing regret, even to a trusted friend. "I have made my choice," Daniel said finally. "I simply need to prove myself to Edward, and then things will settle." Henry did not look convinced, but he respected his friend enough not to push further. As the months passed, Daniel attempted to navigate the delicate balance between asserting his independence and maintaining peace within the family. He agreed to certain compromises regarding his company's structure, hoping that cooperation would eventually earn him the trust Edward seemed determined to withhold. Yet each concession seemed to invite further expectation rather than increased freedom. During a family gathering celebrating Isabel's younger brother's engagement, Daniel overheard a conversation between Edward and one of his business associates that solidified his growing unease. "Ashcombe Manor has always been a useful tool," Edward said quietly, unaware that Daniel stood within earshot near an open doorway. "Whoever holds it must understand that ownership is a privilege granted, not a right guaranteed. Should circumstances change, the family retains every legal means to reclaim what was given." Daniel froze, his stomach tightening, as the weight of those words settled over him. He had assumed, perhaps naively, that the estate was fully and permanently his, a genuine gift, rather than a conditional arrangement. Yet Edward's casual remark suggested otherwise, hinting at legal mechanisms designed to protect the family's control, even over property already transferred. That night, unable to sleep, Daniel quietly reviewed the estate's legal documents, stored within the manor's private study. Buried within pages of formal language, he discovered a clause he had overlooked during the excitement of the wedding, a provision granting the Voss family the right to reclaim ownership under specific conditions, related to loyalty, conduct, and continued alignment with family interests. His hands trembled slightly as he read the words again, the full implications settling over him like ice water. He had not simply been given an estate. He had been given a conditional inheritance, one that could be revoked the moment he stepped outside the boundaries the family had quietly established. The realization sat heavily in his chest, mixing uncomfortably with the pride and comfort he had grown accustomed to since marrying Isabel. Daniel closed the document and sat alone in the dim light of the study, staring out toward the darkened gardens beyond the window. For the first time since leaving Clara, he allowed himself to fully confront the possibility that the life he had chosen might not be the fortress of security he once believed it to be, but rather a carefully constructed cage, beautiful on the outside, yet capable of closing in the moment he failed to meet its silent, ever-present expectations. 2 years into his marriage, Daniel Whitfield had learned to move through the halls of Ashcombe Manor with a practiced, careful grace, the same way he had learned to navigate conversations with Edward Voss, choosing his words with precision, avoiding topics that might invite scrutiny. Yet despite his efforts to maintain peace, an undercurrent of tension had settled permanently into his marriage, one that neither he nor Isabel seemed willing to fully address. The business folded into the Voss Holdings had grown substantially under the family's resources, but Daniel found himself increasingly sidelined within decisions regarding its direction. He was consulted on matters of little consequence, invited to sign documents already finalized by others, and gradually pushed toward a ceremonial role, rather than the leadership position he once held with pride. Each time he raised concerns, Isabel offered reassurance wrapped in gentle deflection, urging patience, promising that trust would eventually restore his authority. One afternoon, Daniel discovered an opportunity that reignited a spark of his old ambition. A struggling shipping company on the coast, independent from any Voss family involvement, sought a new director to help restructure its operations. The position offered Daniel genuine authority, a chance to rebuild something entirely his own, separate from the shadow of his wife's family. Excited by the possibility, he brought the proposal to Isabel over dinner. "This could be exactly what I need," Daniel explained, sliding the proposal papers across the table. "A fresh start, something built on my own decisions again." Isabel studied the documents carefully, her expression unreadable. "It looks like a solid opportunity," she said slowly. "But you know my father will have questions about dividing your attention this way." "It is separate from the family business," Daniel pressed. "I am not asking permission, Isabel. I am simply informing you, as my wife, of a decision that matters to me." Isabel's eyes flickered with something Daniel could not quite identify, perhaps concern, perhaps warning. "Be careful how you present this to my father," she said quietly. "He does not respond well to decisions made without his input, especially regarding anything connected to your standing within this family." Despite her caution, Daniel moved forward, accepting the position at the shipping company, without seeking Edward's formal approval. For the first time in years, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, throwing himself into restructuring plans, meeting with new business partners, and rediscovering the confidence that had once defined him before Ashcombe Manor's grandeur overshadowed his own accomplishments. Word of Daniel's independent venture reached Edward within weeks, delivered not by Daniel himself, but through the family's extensive network of associates who monitored business dealings across various industries. Edward summoned Daniel to his study one evening, his expression carrying a coldness Daniel had rarely witnessed before. "I understand you have taken a position with a shipping company," Edward said, his voice deceptively calm, "without consulting me, without informing the family of your intentions." "It is a separate venture," Daniel replied, standing firm despite the tightening tension in the room. "It does not interfere with our existing arrangements. I simply wanted to build something of my own again." Edward leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel with an expression of quiet disappointment, mixed with something sharper, something calculating. "Everything you have, Daniel, exists because of this family's generosity. Ashcombe Manor, your standing within society, even the resources that allowed your original company to grow. Do you believe yourself entitled to pursue independent ventures without regard for how they reflect upon us?" "I am entitled to build my own future," Daniel said, his voice firm, despite the unease building within him. "I did not marry into this family to become a permanent extension of your empire, sir. I have my own ambitions." The room fell into a heavy silence. Edward's fingers drummed slowly against the desk, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. "Ambition is admirable," he said finally, "but loyalty is essential. I would advise you to reconsider your priorities, Daniel, before you find yourself discovering just how quickly generosity can be withdrawn." Daniel left the study that night with his resolve shaken but not entirely broken. He returned home to Isabel, recounting the conversation with a mixture of frustration and defiance. "He threatened me, Isabel," Daniel said, pacing across their bedroom. "Not directly, but the meaning was clear enough. Everything I have here depends entirely on his approval. Isabel sat quietly on the edge of the bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. My father does not make idle warnings, Daniel. Please, reconsider the shipping company. It is not worth the conflict it is creating. So I am simply meant to remain compliant forever? Daniel asked, his voice rising with frustration. No independence, no decisions of my own, simply gratitude for whatever scraps of authority your father decides to allow me. Isabel's eyes filled with tears, though whether from sympathy or fear, Daniel could not tell. I love you, Daniel, but you do not understand the power my father holds within this family, within this world we live in. Please, for both our sakes, do not push him further. Daniel wanted to reassure her, wanted to promise that everything would remain peaceful, yet something within him had shifted permanently. He had spent years compromising his independence, his voice, his sense of self, all in pursuit of a life he once believed represented success. Standing in that moment, he realized that true success required more than wealth and status. It required the freedom to build something meaningful on his own terms. Despite Isabel's pleas, Daniel continued his involvement with the shipping company, determined to prove that his worth extended beyond the boundaries the Voss family sought to enforce. He worked long hours, traveling between Ashcombe Manor and the coastal offices, slowly rebuilding a sense of purpose that had eroded over years of quiet compliance. However, the consequences of his defiance began manifesting in subtle, unsettling ways. Staff members at Ashcombe Manor, who once treated him with respectful familiarity, grew distant, deferring more frequently to instructions relayed directly from the Voss family office, rather than from Daniel himself. Invitations to family gatherings became less frequent, and when he did attend, conversations shifted uncomfortably whenever he entered a room, as though everyone present understood a tension that remained carefully unspoken. One evening, returning from a lengthy business trip, Daniel discovered a formal letter waiting for him within the manor's private study, delivered by courier rather than handed to him personally by any member of the household staff. The letter, written on official Voss family letterhead, outlined a series of concerns regarding his conduct, his divided loyalties, and his failure to honor the expectations established at the time Ashcombe Manor was transferred into his name. Daniel read the letter twice, his hands growing colder with each line. Buried within formal, carefully constructed language was a clear warning, a reminder that the estate remained legally tied to conditions he had unknowingly agreed to, conditions now allegedly violated by his independent business decisions. The letter did not explicitly threaten immediate action, but its implications were unmistakable. He found Isabel in the manor's grand sitting room later that evening, her expression already carrying the weight of knowledge she had perhaps anticipated for some time. You knew about this letter, Daniel said, holding the document toward her. Did you not? Isabel's silence confirmed his suspicion. Before she finally spoke, my father asked me not to interfere, Daniel. He believed a formal warning might convince you to reconsider your priorities before matters escalated further. Daniel felt a mixture of anger and heartbreak settle over him, directed not only toward Edward's calculated control, but toward Isabel's quiet complicity within a system designed to keep him perpetually indebted, perpetually compliant. He looked around the grand sitting room, once a symbol of everything he believed he had gained, now feeling increasingly like the walls of an elaborate trap slowly closing in around him. I gave up everything for this life, Daniel said quietly, more to himself than to Isabel. My integrity, my independence, even the woman who loved me without condition. And still, none of it seems to be enough to earn genuine trust within this family. Isabel reached toward him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Yet Daniel stepped back, unwilling in that moment to accept comfort from someone who had watched her family's warning unfold, without offering him the courtesy of honesty beforehand. As he stood alone that night, within the grandeur of Ashcombe Manor, Daniel Whitfield began to understand, with painful clarity, that the beautiful life he had built upon ambition and status rested on a foundation far more fragile than he had ever imagined, one that could crumble entirely the moment the Voss family decided his usefulness had come to an end. In the months following the formal warning letter, Daniel Whitfield found himself walking a narrowing path between his own ambitions and the ever-tightening expectations of the Voss family. He continued his work with the shipping company, though quietly, avoiding public mentions of his involvement whenever possible, hoping to ease tensions without fully surrendering the independence he had fought so hard to reclaim. Isabel, caught between her love for Daniel and her loyalty to her family, grew increasingly withdrawn during this period. She spent more time at family gatherings without him, citing his busy schedule as an excuse, though Daniel suspected the truth ran deeper. He noticed subtle changes in her behavior, longer phone calls with her father conducted behind closed doors, hesitant glances whenever his name came up in conversation with relatives, and an overall wariness that had not existed during the earlier years of their marriage. One evening, as autumn settled over the grounds of Ashcombe Manor, Daniel returned from a business trip to find the household staff behaving with unusual formality. The housekeeper, a woman named Beatrice who had always greeted him warmly, avoided eye contact as she informed him that Isabel had left earlier that day to visit her parents and would return the following week. "Did she say why she left so suddenly?" Daniel asked, concern creeping into his voice. "I am not certain, sir," Beatrice replied carefully. "Perhaps it would be best to ask Mrs. Whitfield directly when she returns." Daniel spent the following days in growing unease, attempting to reach Isabel through phone calls that went unanswered, and messages that received only brief, vague replies. When she finally returned to Ashcombe Manor a week later, her demeanor had changed noticeably, carrying a distance he had never before witnessed between them. "Isabel, what is happening?" Daniel asked, following her into their bedroom as she began unpacking her belongings. "You disappear for a week without explanation, and now you barely look at me." Isabel paused, setting down the items in her hands before turning to face him, her expression a complicated mixture of sadness and resolve. "My father has decided to move forward with formal proceedings regarding Ashcombe Manor," she said quietly. "He believes your continued involvement with outside business ventures represents a clear violation of the conditions attached to its transfer." Daniel felt the floor seem to shift beneath him. "Formal proceedings? Isabel, this is our home. You cannot possibly agree with him on this." "I tried to convince him otherwise," Isabel said, her voice trembling slightly. "I truly did, Daniel. But my father does not change his mind once he has decided upon a course of action. He views this as a matter of principle, not simply property." "And what about you?" Daniel asked, his voice rising with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Are you simply going to stand by while your family takes back everything we have built together?" Isabel's eyes filled with tears, though she did not look away. "I am your wife, Daniel, and I love you, but I am also my father's daughter, raised within a family that values loyalty and structure above almost everything else. I do not know how to stand against him without destroying every relationship I have ever known." The conversation left Daniel reeling, the reality of his precarious position finally settling over him with undeniable clarity. He had believed, perhaps naively, that his marriage to Isabel offered him permanent security, a foundation strong enough to withstand disagreements with her father. Yet standing before her in that moment, he understood that within the Voss family, loyalty flowed in only one direction, toward the family's collective interests, regardless of the personal cost to those caught within its structure. In the days that followed, Daniel sought legal counsel, hoping to understand his rights regarding Ashcombe Manor, and whether the conditions Edward referenced could truly be enforced. He met with a lawyer named Oliver Hart, a sharp, experienced attorney, recommended by Henry Colton, someone entirely outside the Voss family's extensive network of influence. "The documents you signed at the time of transfer are unfortunately quite specific," Oliver explained, reviewing the paperwork Daniel had brought with him. "There is a clause allowing reclamation of the property under circumstances defined broadly enough to grant significant discretion to the original grantor, in this case, Edward Voss." "So he can simply take it back?" Daniel asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "Even after 2 years of ownership, after everything I have invested into maintaining and improving the estate?" Oliver sighed, setting the documents down carefully. "Legally, it appears the family retained significant leverage, likely intentionally so. I can certainly attempt to challenge the reclamation on your behalf, but I want to be honest with you, Daniel. Families with resources like the Voss family typically ensure their legal protections are airtight. This will be a difficult fight, and an expensive one." Daniel left the meeting with a heavy heart, the reality of his situation becoming increasingly clear. He had entered his marriage believing wealth and status guaranteed security, only to discover that within families like the Voss lineage, such security remained conditional, granted and revoked, according to standards he had never fully understood, until it was far too late to protect himself. That evening, Daniel sat alone in the manor's study, staring at the legal documents spread across the desk before him. He thought back to the early days of his relationship with Isabel, the excitement and promise that had once defined their courtship, and compared it painfully to the isolation and uncertainty now surrounding him. He thought, too, of Clara, wondering with painful clarity whether he had traded genuine, unconditional love for an illusion of security that had never truly belonged to him at all. Henry Colton visited Ashcombe Manor shortly after Daniel's meeting with the lawyer, his expression carrying genuine concern as he listened to his friend recount the unfolding crisis. "Daniel, I have to ask you honestly," Henry said, sitting across from him in the study. "Do you regret leaving Clara for this life?" Daniel remained silent for a long moment, staring out the window toward the darkened gardens beyond. "I used to tell myself that ambition justified everything, that the life I built here represented true success. But sitting in this study now, watching everything I believed I owned slip away because I dared to build something independent, I am no longer certain I understand what success truly means." Henry placed a reassuring hand on his friend's shoulder. "Whatever happens with the estate, Daniel, you still have the ability to rebuild. You did it once before, with far less than you have now. Do not let this family convince you that your worth depends entirely on what they choose to give or take away." Daniel appreciated his friend's words, though the weight of uncertainty continued pressing heavily upon him. As the legal proceedings regarding Ashcombe Manor began moving forward, he found himself caught between fighting for a life he was no longer certain he wanted, and accepting a loss that might ultimately free him from a family structure built more on control than genuine connection. Isabel remained distant throughout this period, torn between her loyalty to her father and whatever remained of her love for Daniel. Their marriage, once filled with promise and excitement, had settled into a quiet, unspoken tension, both of them aware that the coming months would determine far more than simply the fate of a grand estate. They would determine whether their relationship could survive the pressures of a family that valued control above almost everything else, or whether Daniel's ambitious pursuit of status had ultimately cost him more than he ever could have imagined. The legal battle over Ashcombe Manor stretched across several tense months, during which Daniel Whitfield found himself immersed in a world of formal hearings, mounting attorney fees, and an ever-growing sense of exhaustion that seeped into every corner of his life. Oliver Hart worked diligently on his behalf, gathering evidence of the improvements Daniel had made to the estate, the income he had generated through careful management, and arguments intended to challenge the vague, broadly worded clause Edward Voss relied upon to justify reclaiming the property. Despite Oliver's efforts, the Voss family's legal team proved formidable, presenting a case built upon meticulously documented conditions that Daniel had unknowingly agreed to years earlier. Each hearing chipped away at Daniel's confidence, revealing just how thoroughly Edward had structured the original transfer to protect his family's ultimate control, regardless of how much time passed or how much value Daniel added to the property. During one particularly difficult hearing, Edward's attorney presented a series of documented instances highlighting Daniel's involvement with the shipping company, framing his independent business decisions as clear violations of the loyalty and alignment conditions embedded within the estate's transfer agreement. Daniel sat quietly beside Oliver, listening as his personal ambitions were systematically transformed into evidence against him. Each accomplishment he once took pride in, now weaponized to justify stripping him of everything he had built at Ashcombe Manor. Isabel attended several of the hearings, though she remained largely silent throughout the proceedings, her presence offering little comfort to Daniel as he watched his marriage and his home slowly slip beyond his control. During a brief recess, Daniel approached her in the hallway outside the courtroom, his voice low and strained. "Isabel, you could speak on my behalf," he said. "You know how much effort I invested into maintaining this estate, into honoring your family despite everything. Why will you not stand beside me in this?" Isabel's eyes glistened with unshed tears, though her expression carried a weariness that suggested she had already resigned herself to the outcome. "I have tried speaking with my father privately, Daniel, more times than you know. He does not listen to me on matters he considers principal. I am sorry, but I cannot fight a battle I have no power to win." Her words offered little reassurance, and Daniel returned to the courtroom feeling more isolated than ever, understanding with painful clarity that within the Voss family structure, even a daughter's voice carried limited weight against her father's unwavering authority. As the proceedings continued, Daniel began noticing further erosion of his standing within both the family and the broader social circles he had once eagerly embraced. Invitations to events dwindled. Business associates who once sought his involvement in various ventures grew distant, wary of associating with someone increasingly viewed as being in conflict with one of the region's most powerful families. Daniel realized, with growing bitterness, that much of the social standing he believed he had earned through his own efforts had, in truth, existed only because of his connection to the Voss name, a connection now actively working against him. One evening, as Daniel reviewed case documents late into the night within the Manor's study, Henry Colton arrived unexpectedly, carrying a bottle of wine and an expression of quiet determination. "I figured you could use some company," Henry said, setting the bottle down on the desk. "How are things progressing?" Daniel rubbed his tired eyes, leaning back in his chair. "Not well, Henry. Edward's lawyers have built an airtight case. Oliver believes we may still salvage some financial compensation, but the estate itself will likely be lost." Henry poured 2 glasses of wine, sliding one toward his friend. "Daniel, I know this feels like the end of the world right now, but losing this house does not mean losing everything. You still have your skills, your determination, the very qualities that allowed you to build something from nothing once before." "It is not just the house," Daniel admitted quietly. "It is everything that came with it. My marriage feels like it is unraveling alongside the estate. Isabel stands by, watching her father dismantle the life we built together, unable or unwilling to fight for either of us." Henry studied his friend carefully before speaking. "Have you considered that perhaps this entire situation reveals something important, Daniel? Not just about the Voss family, but about the choices that led you here in the first place?" Daniel remained silent, Henry's words settling uncomfortably within him. He thought of Clara often during these difficult months, memories resurfacing with increasing frequency, memories of a simpler life, built on genuine partnership rather than conditional status. He wondered, with a mixture of guilt and longing, whether she had moved forward entirely, whether she ever thought of him at all amid the life she had rebuilt for herself. As if sensing the direction of his friend's thoughts, Henry spoke again, his voice gentle but direct. "Clara has done remarkably well for herself, Daniel. She started her own small design firm about a year ago. I ran into her recently at a community event. She seemed genuinely happy, surrounded by good friends, building something entirely her own." Daniel absorbed this information with a complicated mixture of emotions, pride mingling uncomfortably with regret. "I am glad she found her footing again," he said quietly. "She deserved far better than what I gave her." The following weeks brought increasing clarity regarding the likely outcome of the legal proceedings. Oliver informed Daniel that while they might secure limited financial compensation for improvements made to the estate, the property itself would almost certainly be returned to Voss family control, given the strength of the original transfer agreement's conditions. Daniel received this news with a strange sense of resignation rather than surprise, having gradually prepared himself over the preceding months for an outcome that increasingly seemed inevitable. At home, tensions between Daniel and Isabel reached a breaking point during a quiet dinner one evening, the weight of months of unspoken frustration finally surfacing. "I need to know something, Isabel," Daniel said, setting down his utensils and looking directly at her. "If the court rules in your father's favor, if Ashcombe Manor returns to your family's control, what happens to us? Do you stay by my side, or does your loyalty ultimately belong entirely to your father?" Isabel's hands trembled slightly as she met his gaze, her expression carrying genuine anguish. "Daniel, I love you. Truly I do. But I do not know how to exist outside the world my family has built for me. I do not know if I possess the strength to choose you over everything I have ever known." Her honesty, though painful, offered Daniel a strange sense of clarity. He realized, sitting across from the woman he had once believed represented his path toward a brighter, more significant future, that their entire relationship had been built upon an imbalance he had failed to recognize until circumstances forced it into painful visibility. Isabel's love, however genuine, existed within boundaries dictated entirely by her family's expectations, boundaries that left little room for the kind of unconditional partnership Daniel had once shared with Clara. That night, lying awake in the grand bedroom of a house that no longer felt like his own, Daniel Whitfield began quietly preparing himself for a future far different from the one he had envisioned when he first left Clara Bennett, for the promise of wealth, status, and belonging within the Voss family. He understood now, with painful but undeniable clarity, that the life he had chosen offered neither the security nor the genuine connection he had once mistakenly believed it guaranteed. The final ruling regarding Ashcombe Manor arrived on a gray morning, delivered through a formal letter from the courthouse that Daniel Whitfield read alone in the study, the same room where he had once celebrated Edward Voss's generous wedding gift with excitement and gratitude. The judge had sided largely with the Voss family's legal team, upholding the conditions embedded within the original transfer agreement and ordering the estate returned to family control within 60 days. Daniel would receive modest financial compensation for certain documented improvements, but the house, the land, and the legacy attached to it would no longer bear his name. He sat motionless for a long while after reading the letter, staring at the familiar walls of the study, the shelves lined with books he had grown fond of over the years, the window overlooking gardens he had walked through countless mornings, absorbing the strange, hollow feeling of losing something he had never truly possessed in the first place. The ruling did not surprise him, given everything Oliver Hart had prepared him for in recent weeks. Yet reading the official confirmation still struck him with unexpected weight. Isabel found him there an hour later, the letter still resting on the desk before him. She approached quietly, her eyes red from tears she had clearly shed elsewhere, unwilling to face him with her grief until she had composed herself, at least outwardly. "I am so sorry, Daniel," she said softly, standing near the doorway rather than approaching further. "I know this was not the outcome either of us wanted." Daniel looked up at her, studying her face for a long moment before responding. "Did you ever truly want a different outcome, Isabel? Or did some part of you always understand that your father would ultimately win, regardless of how the proceedings unfolded?" Isabel flinched slightly at the directness of his question, though she did not deny it. "I wanted us to be happy, Daniel. I wanted to believe we could build something lasting, separate from my father's control. But I have lived within his influence my entire life. I do not think I ever truly believed we could escape it." Her admission, though painful, offered Daniel a strange sense of closure. He had spent months wondering whether Isabel's love for him had been genuine, or simply another expression of her family's careful calculations, whether their entire relationship had existed as anything more than an extension of the Voss family's broader interests. Standing in the study that morning, surrounded by the remnants of a life about to be dismantled, he finally understood that the truth existed somewhere uncomfortably in between. Isabel had loved him, in her own way, but that love had never possessed the strength to stand independently against the powerful current of her family's expectations. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began the difficult process of packing his belongings, watching as the grand rooms of Ashcombe Manor slowly emptied of the personal items he had accumulated during his years there. The household staff, though polite, maintained a careful distance, aware that their loyalty would soon transfer entirely back to the family that had originally employed them. Beatrice, the housekeeper who had once greeted him warmly, offered quiet condolences as he prepared to leave. "You were kind to this household, sir," she said, helping him carry a final box toward the waiting car. "Whatever happens next, I hope you find peace." Daniel thanked her sincerely, touched by the small gesture of genuine warmth amid an otherwise cold and formal transition. As he loaded the last of his belongings into the car, he took one final look at the grand house that had briefly defined his life, feeling a complicated mixture of grief, relief, and quiet acceptance settle over him. Isabel stood near the entrance as he prepared to depart, her expression carrying visible sorrow. "Where will you go?" she asked quietly. "I am not entirely certain yet," Daniel admitted. "Henry offered me a place to stay temporarily while I sort things out. Beyond that, I suppose I will need to rebuild, much like I did before all of this began." "Will we see each other again?" Isabel asked, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel considered the question carefully before answering honestly. "I do not know, Isabel. I think, for now, we both need time to understand what remains of us outside the walls of this estate, outside your father's influence." Perhaps that answer will become clearer with time. He offered her a final, gentle smile, neither cruel nor overly warm, simply an acknowledgement of the complicated history they shared, before climbing into the car and driving away from Ashcombe Manor for what he suspected might be the last time. Henry welcomed Daniel into his modest but comfortable home with genuine warmth, offering him a spare room and the kind of unconditional support Daniel realized he had sorely missed during his years within the Voss family's orbit. Over the following weeks, Daniel began the slow process of rebuilding his life, focusing his energy on the shipping company that had originally sparked the conflict with Edward Voss, now finally free to pursue its growth without the looming shadow of family disapproval. "It feels strange," Daniel admitted to Henry one evening, sitting on the modest back porch of his friend's home, a stark contrast to the grand gardens of Ashcombe Manor. "For the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe without worrying about someone else's approval." Henry smiled, handing him a cup of coffee. "That is called freedom, Daniel. It took losing everything for you to remember what it feels like." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the truth within his friend's words. He thought often during this period about the choices that had led him to this point. The ambition that had once seemed so clear and justified, now revealed as a pursuit built more on illusion than genuine understanding of what truly mattered. He thought too of Clara, wondering whether the life she had built for herself reflected the kind of authentic happiness he now recognized he had sacrificed in pursuit of status and wealth. One afternoon, while running errands in town, Daniel found himself walking past a small design studio, its window displaying elegant, thoughtfully arranged furniture and decor. He paused, recognizing the name painted delicately across the glass storefront, Bennett Design Studio. His heart quickened as he realized this must be the business Henry had mentioned, the venture Clara had built entirely on her own, following their painful separation. Through the window, he caught a brief glimpse of her, standing near a display table, laughing warmly with a customer as she gestured toward a set of handcrafted items. She looked genuinely happy, radiant, in a way Daniel had not seen in years, her confidence and warmth evident even from a distance. He stood there for a long moment, torn between the urge to enter and the understanding that he likely had no right to disrupt the peaceful life she had rebuilt without him. Ultimately, Daniel chose to walk away, respecting the boundaries of a life that no longer included him, yet carrying with him a renewed clarity regarding the mistakes of his past. He returned to Henry's home that evening, quieter than usual, reflecting deeply on the winding, painful journey that had led him from the comfort of genuine love toward the hollow allure of status, and finally, toward the difficult, humbling process of rebuilding himself from the ground up once again. 6 months after leaving Ashcombe Manor, Daniel Whitfield had settled into a small apartment above a bakery near the edge of town, a modest space that stood in stark contrast to the grandeur he had once called home. Yet within its simple walls, he found a sense of peace that had eluded him during his years within the Voss family's sprawling estate. The shipping company he had fought so hard to maintain had grown steadily under his renewed focus, no longer burdened by the constant approval and oversight that once suffocated his every decision. Isabel reached out occasionally during this period, brief messages checking on his well-being, updates about family matters he no longer felt connected to. Their conversations remained polite but distant, both of them slowly accepting that whatever connection they once shared had been fundamentally altered by the circumstances surrounding their separation. Daniel harbored no bitterness toward her, understanding by now that Isabel, too, had been shaped and constrained by a family structure that valued control above genuine partnership. One evening, Henry Colton invited Daniel to a small community fundraising event held at the local community center, an initiative supporting families affected by recent flooding in the region. Daniel agreed, grateful for the distraction and the opportunity to reconnect with the town he had drifted away from during his years of pursuing status within the Voss family's world. The event buzzed with warmth and genuine community spirit, local business owners offering donations, volunteers organizing activities, children laughing as they participated in games set up across the community center's modest lawn. Daniel moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasant conversations with familiar faces he had not seen in years, feeling a quiet sense of belonging he had almost forgotten existed. It was there, near a table displaying handmade crafts for auction, that Daniel saw Clara Bennett again, standing among a group of volunteers, organizing items with the same careful, thoughtful attention he remembered from years earlier. She looked radiant, her laughter easy and genuine, as she interacted with the children helping arrange the display. Daniel hesitated, uncertain whether approaching her would be welcome or intrusive, yet something within him, perhaps courage born from months of humbling reflection, urged him forward. "Clara," he said softly, approaching the table with careful, respectful distance. She turned, her expression shifting through a range of emotions: surprise, wariness, and finally, a cautious, measured calm. "Daniel," she said simply, studying him for a long moment. "I did not expect to see you here. I have been trying to reconnect with the community lately," Daniel explained honestly. "Henry mentioned the event, and I thought it might be a good opportunity to give back, considering everything." An awkward silence settled between them, filled with years of unspoken history. Clara glanced briefly toward the other volunteers, before gesturing toward a quieter corner of the community center's lawn. "Would you like to talk for a moment?" she asked. "I imagine we both have things we never properly said to each other." Daniel nodded, grateful for the opportunity, following her to a bench positioned beneath a large oak tree, away from the bustling crowd. "I heard about what happened," Clara said once they settled onto the bench, her tone carrying neither malice nor satisfaction, simply honest acknowledgement. "The estate, the family, all of it. I am sorry things turned out the way they did, Daniel, even after everything." Daniel studied her carefully, appreciating the genuine compassion within her words, despite everything he had put her through. "You have every right to feel differently, Clara. I would understand if you felt some measure of satisfaction, given how I treated you." Clara shook her head gently. "I spent a long time feeling angry, Daniel, and hurt, more than I care to admit, but holding on to that anger never helped me build the life I wanted for myself. Eventually, I had to let it go, for my own sake, not necessarily for yours." "You have built something remarkable," Daniel said, glancing toward the design studio's promotional banner displayed near the event's entrance. "I saw your studio downtown. It looks wonderful." Clara smiled, genuine pride evident in her expression. "It has been a challenging journey, but a rewarding one. I built it entirely on my own terms, without compromise, without needing anyone else's approval to validate my worth." Her words struck Daniel deeply, highlighting the stark contrast between the life she had built through quiet determination and the hollow, conditional existence he had once pursued within the Voss family's world. "I admire that, Clara, more than you probably realize. I spent years chasing status and security within a family that ultimately valued control far more than genuine connection. I lost sight of what truly matters." Clara studied him thoughtfully, her expression softening slightly. "I am glad you found clarity, Daniel, even if it came through difficult circumstances. Everyone deserves the chance to learn and grow from their mistakes." They spoke for a while longer, catching up on the years that had passed, carefully avoiding topics too painful to fully revisit, yet finding an unexpected comfort in the honesty of their conversation. As the event wound down, Clara stood, offering Daniel a small, genuine smile. "It was good seeing you again, Daniel," she said. "I hope you continue finding your way forward." "Thank you, Clara," Daniel replied sincerely. "And thank you for your kindness today. I know I do not necessarily deserve it, but I am grateful for it nonetheless." Clara offered a final, understanding nod before returning to her volunteer duties, leaving Daniel sitting alone beneath the oak tree, reflecting on the unexpected encounter. He felt no illusions about rekindling their past relationship, understanding fully that too much time and too much pain separated the life they once shared from the people they had each become. Yet the conversation offered him something valuable nonetheless, a sense of closure, and perhaps more importantly, a clearer understanding of the kind of authentic, unconditional strength he hoped to cultivate within himself moving forward. Walking home that evening beneath a sky filled with early evening stars, Daniel Whitfield felt lighter than he had in years, freed not only from the constraints of the Voss family's control, but from the lingering guilt and confusion that had followed him since the painful choices of his past. He understood now, with hard-earned clarity, that true security did not come from grand estates or prestigious family names, but from the quiet, steady integrity of building a life rooted in honesty, humility, and genuine connection. A year after the community fundraising event, Daniel Whitfield stood in the doorway of his newly leased office space, a modest but well-organized headquarters for the shipping company he had rebuilt from the ground up. Gone were the marble floors and sprawling gardens of Ashcombe Manor, replaced instead by simple, functional furnishings that reflected a business built on genuine effort rather than borrowed prestige. He had grown the company steadily over the past year, securing new contracts through hard work and honest reputation, rather than family connections or inherited status. His divorce from Isabel had been finalized quietly several months earlier, both of them agreeing that continuing their marriage under the weight of unresolved tension and divided loyalty served neither of their interests. The separation had been amicable, surprisingly free of the bitterness Daniel once feared might accompany the end of their relationship. Isabel had eventually reached out one final time, expressing genuine well wishes for his future, an acknowledgement that perhaps, in different circumstances, their story might have unfolded differently. "I hope you find happiness, Daniel," she had written in her final message. "Truly, I do. I am sorry our life together could not survive outside the world my family built around us." Daniel had responded with equal sincerity, wishing her well in return, understanding by then that neither of them bore sole responsibility for the complicated circumstances that had ultimately unraveled their marriage. He harbored no lingering resentment, choosing instead to view the experience as a difficult but necessary lesson in understanding the true foundations required for lasting happiness. Henry Colton remained a steady presence throughout Daniel's rebuilding process, occasionally joining him for dinner to discuss business developments or simply to share a quiet evening, reflecting on how far Daniel had come since the difficult months following his departure from Ashcombe Manor. "You seem different these days," Henry observed one evening as they shared a meal at a small restaurant downtown. "Calmer, more grounded, somehow." Daniel smiled, nodding in agreement. "I feel different, Henry. For the first time in years, I am building something entirely on my own terms, without needing anyone else's approval or validation. It is humbling, but incredibly freeing." Their conversation shifted naturally toward Clara, whose design studio had continued flourishing over the past year, gaining recognition throughout the region for its thoughtful, elegant craftsmanship. Daniel had occasionally seen updates about her business through mutual acquaintances, feeling genuine happiness for her continued success, without the complicated emotions that once accompanied thoughts of their shared past. "Have you spoken with her recently?" Henry asked carefully. "Not since the fundraising event last year," Daniel admitted. "I think we both needed that space to fully move forward. I do not regret the conversation we shared that day, but I also understand it offered closure rather than a new beginning." Henry nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes closure is exactly what allows people to build genuinely new beginnings, separate from old expectations. Daniel appreciated his friend's wisdom, recognizing the truth within his words. Over the following months, he continued focusing his energy on rebuilding both his business and his personal sense of identity, gradually rediscovering passions and friendships that had been neglected during his years pursuing status within the Voss family's world. He reconnected with old colleagues, mentored young entrepreneurs within the community, and slowly built a reputation defined not by inherited wealth, but by genuine competence and integrity. One afternoon, while attending a regional business conference focused on sustainable trade practices, Daniel found himself seated beside a woman named Grace Ellison, an environmental consultant whose thoughtful insights during panel discussions immediately caught his attention. Their conversation flowed naturally throughout the conference, discovering shared interests in ethical business practices and community development initiatives. Unlike his whirlwind courtship with Isabel years earlier, Daniel approached his growing connection with Grace with deliberate patience, taking time to build genuine understanding and trust, rather than rushing toward grand gestures or promises of status. Their relationship developed slowly over subsequent months, grounded in mutual respect, shared values, and honest communication, qualities Daniel now recognized as essential foundations for any lasting partnership. "You seem to approach relationships differently than most people I have dated," Grace observed one evening, as they shared a simple dinner at Daniel's modest apartment. "Thoughtful, patient, genuinely present, rather than distracted by outside expectations." Daniel smiled, appreciating her perceptiveness. "I learned some difficult lessons in my past relationships, Grace. I once believed status and security came from external validation, from grand gestures and impressive circumstances. It took losing nearly everything to understand that genuine connection requires something far simpler: honesty, patience, and mutual respect. Grace studied him thoughtfully, clearly moved by his vulnerability. I appreciate you sharing that with me, Daniel. It takes real strength to learn from painful experiences, rather than allowing them to harden you against future connection. Their relationship continued developing naturally, free from the pressures and conditions that had once defined Daniel's marriage to Isabel. He found himself building a life increasingly centered on authenticity, rather than appearance, prioritizing genuine happiness over external markers of success he had once believed essential. Meanwhile, Daniel's shipping company continued its steady growth, eventually securing a significant contract that solidified its reputation as a reliable, ethical player within the regional logistics industry. He hired additional staff, expanded operations modestly but sustainably, and took genuine pride in building something entirely through his own effort and integrity, free from the shadow of inherited privilege or family obligation. Reflecting on his journey during a quiet evening walk through town, Daniel passed by the community center, where he had reconnected with Clara during the fundraising event over a year earlier. He paused for a moment, allowing himself to fully appreciate the distance he had traveled since those difficult, uncertain days following his departure from Ashcombe Manor. He no longer viewed that chapter of his life with bitterness or regret, but rather as a necessary, humbling lesson that had ultimately guided him toward a far more genuine and fulfilling path forward. As he continued his walk beneath the gentle glow of streetlights, illuminating the familiar town he now called home once again, Daniel Whitfield felt a quiet, steady sense of peace settle over him, understanding fully that true wealth and lasting security existed not within grand estates or prestigious family names, but within the honest, patient cultivation of genuine relationships, meaningful work, and unwavering personal integrity. 2 years after losing Ashcombe Manor, Daniel Whitfield stood before a small gathering of employees and community members at the grand opening of his shipping company's newly expanded headquarters, a modest but meaningful milestone representing years of dedicated, honest effort. The building, though far smaller than the grand estate he once called home, carried a significance that far surpassed anything Ashcombe Manor had ever represented, a symbol of achievement earned entirely through his own resilience and integrity. Grace Ellison stood beside him during the ceremony, her hand resting gently in his, a quiet but powerful testament to the genuine partnership they had built together over the past year. Their relationship had grown steadily, grounded in mutual respect, shared values, and an authenticity Daniel had once believed impossible to find within his previous pursuit of status and wealth. "You should be proud of what you have built here, Daniel," Grace said softly, as the small crowd began mingling following the ceremony's conclusion. "This represents years of genuine hard work, not inherited privilege." Daniel smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "I could not have rebuilt any of this without the lessons I learned along the way, Grace, painful as they were, and I certainly could not have done it without your support these past months." Henry Colton approached shortly after, offering a warm, congratulatory embrace. "Look at you now, Daniel. From losing everything to building something even more meaningful. I always knew you had it in you." "I appreciate you standing by me through all of it, Henry," Daniel replied sincerely. "I do not think I could have found my way back without your friendship." As the celebration continued, Daniel noticed a familiar face among the small crowd of community members who had come to show their support. Clara Bennett stood near the refreshment table, engaged in friendly conversation with several other local business owners. She caught his eye briefly, offering a warm, genuine smile before returning to her conversation, a simple gesture reflecting the peaceful, mutual respect they had cultivated since their reconnection at the fundraising event years earlier. Later that evening, as the gathering began winding down, Clara approached Daniel and Grace, offering warm congratulations. "This is a wonderful achievement, Daniel," she said sincerely. "I am genuinely happy to see how far you have come." "Thank you, Clara," Daniel replied, introducing her to Grace. "It means a great deal, coming from you especially." Clara smiled warmly at Grace. "It is lovely to meet you. Daniel deserves genuine happiness, and it shows in the way he speaks about you." The three of them shared a brief, comfortable conversation, free from the awkwardness or tension that might have once accompanied such an interaction. Daniel marveled internally at how far they had all traveled from the painful circumstances of years earlier, each of them building genuine, meaningful lives through resilience, honesty, and hard-earned wisdom. As the evening concluded and guests began departing, Daniel found a quiet moment to reflect alone on the building's newly finished balcony, overlooking the modest but bustling street below. Grace joined him after a few minutes, wrapping her arm gently around his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. "I am thinking about how strange life can be, Grace. I once believed happiness required grand estates, prestigious family names, constant validation from people who ultimately valued control over genuine connection. It took losing nearly everything to understand that true security comes from something far simpler and far more meaningful." Grace leaned her head gently against his shoulder. "And what does true security look like to you now?" Daniel smiled, gazing out over the quiet town he now called home. A life built entirely through honest effort, genuine relationships, and hard-earned self-awareness. "It looks like this, Grace. Genuine partnership, meaningful work, honest friendships, and the freedom to build a life on my own terms, without needing anyone else's approval to validate my worth." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last light of evening fade gently over the town below, both of them fully present within a relationship built on authenticity rather than illusion. Daniel Whitfield understood now, with hard-earned clarity, that the painful journey he had traveled, from abandoning genuine love for the promise of wealth and status, through the humbling loss of an estate that had never truly belonged to him in any meaningful sense, had ultimately guided him toward a far more authentic and fulfilling understanding of what it truly meant to build a life of lasting value. The grand estate, the prestigious family name, the illusion of security he had once pursued so desperately, none of it compared to the quiet, steady peace he now experienced, a peace built not upon inherited privilege, but upon the genuine, hard-earned wisdom gained through resilience, humility, and an unwavering commitment to authenticity. As the stars began emerging gently over the town, Daniel Whitfield finally understood that the truest measure of a meaningful life rested not within grand estates or prestigious titles, but within the honest, steady cultivation of genuine relationships, meaningful purpose, and the quiet, unwavering strength found only through embracing life's most difficult, yet ultimately most valuable lessons.